Well, we recently saw President Joe Biden standing along Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell as the two came together to show bipartisan legislative accomplishments that have happened and also to make an announcement on $2 billion in infrastructure dollars that would go towards upgrading the Brent Spence Bridge there, and also to show that in the midst of all this chaos that we're seeing happening in Congress at the time it was picking the speaker, that the two sides would be able to work together. But I want to zero down on these infrastructure bills and infrastructure bill and projects and what lies ahead. And with that is the man that the president appointed to coordinate this large $1.2 trillion, the largest of federal investments in infrastructure, put over this project is Mr. Mitch Landrieu. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Ebony? Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year to you too. And what a new year, kicking off talking about all things infrastructure, which I was very glad to see. You were there. Give us a picture of where we are when it comes to infrastructure.
Well, you heard the president say that day in his speech that you can't have a strong country either at home or abroad without a strong economy. And you can't have a great economy without great infrastructure. It is physically and literally the thing that everything rests upon, especially when you're rebuilding in communities that have been left out for a long period of time, so that everybody in the country has not only a responsibility, but the opportunity to grow generational wealth and to build the economy from what the president says is the bottom up and the middle out, which kind of is a fancy way of saying in a neighborhood where we all live. And so the president that day was doing something really special. Remember, it's a $1.2 trillion bill. It's designed to help rebuild the roads, the bridges, the airports, the ports, the waterways, give everybody access to high-speed internet, whether you're in the lower Ninth Ward or in the hollows of Kentucky or you're on the south side of Chicago, and then building a clean energy economy. That's the big picture. Last year, we had 7,000 projects coming out of the ground. This year, we'll have 20,000 projects. And one of the bigger, more visible parts of this, of course, are these big bridges that connect communities where the communities wouldn't exist if you didn't have it. And this particular bridge, the Brent Spence Bridge, which joins Kentucky and Ohio, was one of those symbols of what the president talked about when he ran. It was pretty simple. He said, look, I'm going to use my power to bring people together and to get big things done, because in America, the only way we've ever done big things is when we've come together. So that particular day, as the start of the new year, was the president's receipt, his promise, right? And delivering on the promise that he was actually going to deliver something fantastic. And there were a couple of things going on that day. Obviously, one was him standing with Republicans, showing that how when they come together, they can put money in the pot, right, to build big things. That was one thing. But there was something else that I thought was actually as significant, if not more so. You had the federal government and the president and the senators, and then you had the state government with the governors, and then you had the mayors, then you had the faith-based community, the labor community, the not-for-profits, all of America, both political on all of the different levels, that were also indicative of what it's going to take to get it done. That's the first thing. The second thing that happened that many people may not have been paying attention to was that on that same day, the vice president went to Chicago and was on the south side. And then the secretary of transportation was in Connecticut, and I was supposed to go to San Francisco for the Golden Gate Bridge, but we got upset because of weather and other stuff. So when you think about delivering on a promise that people have been making to America for the last 50 years, the president actually showed up with receipts and is actually making it happen.
Let's get into, because you are in this position to help keep equity at the center.
Correct.
And when we look at these projects, we see highways in some areas, road projects, but just like you talked about before, there's been a disinvestment in Black communities. And then when we look back to the 50s and 60s, we see that there were highways built to separate communities. Right. So what about areas where we see great projects coming? How are you making sure that you're also not dividing Black communities, that there's an investment there? Because that's some of the concern that I've heard from people on the ground, excited about this money, excited about these roads. But what are we going to see as far as that?
Well, first of all, thank you for recognizing that. The African-American community had two things happen. And one, direct investment in communities that split Black communities with intention, right, and consequence, and then a disinvestment in a positive way. And both of those things converged to create the situation where the African American community wasn't able to keep up with everybody else. So the president, when he came in, said, look, when I build an infrastructure law, this is not just about building roads and bridges and airports, it's about rebuilding communities. And so when the bill was structured, and the programs that are competitive, there's a lens through which all of these programs are analyzed. And the president said, listen, we're going to invest in communities that have been left behind. We're not leaving anybody behind, not rural folks, not urban folks, not poor white folks, not other folks, African American community that have been left behind. And so when you apply for a grant on the grant side of this program, you have to demonstrate that this project is actually going to lift the community up. So that's one, just in terms of the design of the program. All right. But then when you actually get down to the ground, the funding mechanism in some of the programs are specifically designed to reconnect communities. So on the road side of this, remember I told you roads, bridges, airports, ports, waterways, just on the road side of it, there's about $4 billion that has been set aside in the infrastructure bill that I oversee and then the Inflation Reduction Act, but they just one idea, which is how we're going to actually reconnect communities that have been disconnected intentionally over time. As I've said many, many times, if you talk to black folk and say, hey, where do you live? African Americans in this community will say, I live on the other side of. And everybody knows, right, that means on the other side of the tracks, on the other side of the water, on the other side of the bridge at the bottom of my community, I live on the other side of, because when they designed this thing, the intention was, or the consequence of the not being sensitive was that the poor folks are going to live over here, which when you say poor in the South, you generally are intimating that it's not necessarily black, but mostly, right?
And the other side too, because I want to stop you really quick. When you say that, anytime I've heard someone, and you're very right, say that, I know what that comes with. I know what the other side comes with. I know I'm going to see, we're going to have problems, broadband problems. We're going to have poverty. We're going to have economic issues in our areas and from our school system. So that whole other side, and some of that is, other parts of that is also in this bill.
Correct. And this bill is designed to work through that problem and to fix that problem. And it's specific where these dollars are designed to reconnect these communities with especially road projects. You see the same thing with broadband. You'll see the same thing with the investment in get rid of lead out of water and lead pipes in communities where our kids are sucking dangerous water out of those pipes. You see the same thing with EPA on cleaning up the sewage systems, because many of our folks don't have indoor plumbing, 2 million people in the country. And so you go to the Black Belt, you see a lot of this. And so all of this bill, or a huge portion of it, is designed to really focus on those areas, and we continue to work on that. That's the Reconnect program. And then there's the Justice 40 initiative, which means that 40% of the impact should be in areas that have been left out before, that, of course, a large portion of the African American community lives in as well.
Now, you've gone to over 36 cities. I know you're going to have more coming up with that. My question is, even though there's been this large investment and this always looms, number one, is there a state coordinator in each state? Is that everywhere? Because I wasn't sure if there was an issue in some states, but is there a state coordinator everywhere? And then second part is, this money is allocated, but then states have the ability to fund what they want, and equity may not be at the center. So you're in charge of bringing this together. How has that been?
Well, you ask me two separate questions. So the first one is there a state coordinator in every state? Now, remember, I said one of the blessed things about the conference the other day was you saw the president, the governors, the senators, and the mayors together. And so the point of getting money to the ground and getting it out of the ground, you have to have coordination, communication, collaboration between and amongst all of the levels of the government, right? And some of that's just practical. And one of the ways I thought would be helpful to do that on behalf of the president was to ask each of the governors in the country to appoint an infrastructure coordinator who would not only have to work up towards Washington, but also have to work sideways in all of the different cabinet levels on the state and then down to the mayors. Because as you mentioned, and this will get to the second part of your question, and yes, by the way, every governor has appointed an infrastructure coordinator. But the second part of your question is, what do you do if some states don't think like the president thinks? Because half of this money just goes to the governors through formulas. So whether they're Republican governors or Democratic governors, it just goes to them. And they spend the money the way their legislature and senators and council members and mayors let them. So there's nothing in this bill that alleviates the responsibility of regular citizens to go to their state governments to make sure that they and their communities get their fair share. That's number one. But we are watching from Washington. And if, for example, a governor wanted to build an interstate through a historically African-American community, we would go, well, no, you can't do that. We're going to have an argument. There are some things they can do. However, on the other half of the bill, where they have to apply on the competitive side, this is about 45% of it, there are really kind of rules and that they have to abide by. And if they don't hit the marks of what the president thinks is a better America, because the programs are oversubscribed, they're not likely to win. So if you want to win, your application has to have in it equity. Your application has to have in it using products that are made in America. Your application has to have Justice 40. Your application has to have, so like you got to answer the test the right way in order for us to say, yeah, you win. So you do it both ways. It's not perfect. You know, this bill was constructed by Congress that laid on 50 years of the way they deliver projects to the ground. But this is the most aggressive, robust, and overt attempt to make sure that everybody in the country is included in the responsibilities and the benefit. And guess what? It's not just about race. We're actually talking about poor rural areas where there are people who are predominantly white that have lived a long time, or poor rural areas where African Americans have lived, or urban areas where both live. Because one of the things that this country has really gotten confused about is that rural is white and urban is black. And of course, that's, if you live in Appalachia, you live in the Mississippi Delta, you live in the Black Belt, you know that that's not true either. So the president wants to see everybody, and he wants to make sure he lifts the bottom up because he thinks that's what helps build the middle class. And if the middle class is doing well, then everybody in the country, especially the wealthy, are going to do fine, as they always do.
Really quickly before we go, two questions. One, what do you see as some of the challenges going forward? We do have a new Congress. There are, there's some opposition that may be coming forth. I saw it was Shelley Capito who was talking about wanting the administration not to restrict where highways are. There may be a looming fight over that. What are some of the challenges that you see?
Well, yes, that's going to happen. There are going to be people that disagree with the way our administration is implementing the bill, but I haven't seen or heard of any kind of fight that was outside of the norms of what you would expect when folks that think differently argue about how to do a particular thing. So that's always a challenge, but that's kind of an everyday challenge that you would have no matter what game you were playing against whoever. I would back up for a second. I think there are a couple of bigger challenges that we all have. And these things are pretty easily seeable. One of them is having enough people to do the work that needs to be done, and then matching people's skills with the work that needs to be done in the place where people live. I think that's a real challenge for our country because we haven't been in the habit of building this much this fast in the last 40 or 50 years. The second thing is smaller communities, and this is predominantly where lower income and moderate income people live. Those towns and counties don't have the expertise to apply as quickly for the grants as, let's say, a big city would be, whether the city's African American or white. So Atlanta, for example, is going to be in a much better position to compete for big money than, let's say, Loudoun County, Alabama. Both majority African American, but one's smaller, one's bigger. The same is true about areas where poor white folks live or big cities that are in the Northeast. So one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that we get technical assistance through the National League of Cities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and all of, the Urban League is helping reach out to communities so they're aware of it. And by the way, if you go to build.gov, that is a roadmap to try to figure out how to get to these programs. The other thing is getinternetforall.gov. And because the Affordable Connectivity Program helps us connect people to free internet service as well. So we have these tools out there that people can use to access and help themselves. It's called getinternet.gov.
Okay, we'll make sure we.
The other is build, BUILD.gov.
Getinternet.gov and build.gov. Last thing, I want to just kind of reflect a little bit. This is a major project, but we've seen you at your best at work, especially working as mayor of New Orleans when you helped to rebuild after Katrina. But you followed in the footsteps of your late father, Moon Landrieu. And when I was just looking over his record and his rights and civil rights and how many times he had to stand up, sometimes being the only white man in the room, raising his hands and going against hell and damnation when it came to integration and segregation and what to do with that. This moment that you're in right now, and condolences to you and your family for his passing in September. This is hard times for people. We're starting a new year, but many of us are starting New Year still mourning from the previous year. Are there moments when you just have this inner convo, this spiritual convo with your dad and like, okay, come on, what do we do here?
Yeah. Well, he was, well, thank you for remembering him. I miss him very much. He kind of felt like, why would you let anybody have anything to say about how you live? So you got to get involved, or else the other folks that don't think right are going to be in it, number one. And number two, you ought to all be standing up for each other. And the third thing he would say to me when I would get scared, I'd call him sometime when I was mayor and I'm like, I'm lost. I don't know what to do. He would like, man, look, use your power to help people. And he goes, if you have political capital, what else are you going to use it for? I mean, why do you have it? You ought to quit doing what you're doing if you don't want to try to help other people. And so that kind of sense of persistence, this sense of, the need that all of us are in this together and that we ought to all lift everybody up. And that times are tough. And when times are tough, that's really kind of when people do have to show up and try to be their best selves. You said something that really struck me. The last couple of years has been tough in this country, no doubt about it, for those of us that have lost loved ones just through old age and, of course, through COVID. Yeah. But if you think about it, the first 22 years in this country of this, century has been really hard, from 9/11 to the Iraq wars, Afghanistan, and, all of the things that have happened since then. You had the recession in 2008, and the crisis that we had back then. You had the election of President Trump and the social upheaval that attached to that. You have the death of George Floyd. Yeah. You've had massive a number of mass shootings, which just make people feel so vulnerable. And it's such a painful thing for us to watch in our country. And then, of course, the climate catastrophic events that have occurred, from Katrina to Rita to Ike to Gustav to the BP oil spill to now all of the stuff that we saw in Florida. People are feeling unsettled and uncertain. But I will say this to you. And the president says this a lot, and I really agree with him 100% on this, that there's never been a better time for America now to kind of right itself, to organize itself, to focus, and to just choose to start making better choices together. And that's what you have to do, because the cavalry is not coming to save us. There ain't nobody else out there. It's just us. And people really do have to think about now that we've seen the excesses that we've witnessed in ourselves in the last 4 or 5 years, that we could take ourselves over a cliff if we don't really start thinking about how to get right and to be better, as the preacher would say. It's time to settle up, and it's time to get focused. And this president has to his great credit, because he's such a good and kind man. He's tough as well, but I think he says that the greatness of America is intimately connected and cannot be separated from its goodness. It is our goodness that actually gives us the potential to be great. And sometimes we're not as good as we should be. We got to think about that. And we got to think about, at the end of the day, understanding that the greatness in America is in our ability for 330 million of us, each and every one of us who is a distinct human being, unique, right, have to figure out a way how to live together in peace that gives us all the opportunity to enjoy the freedoms, that God has granted to all of us. And I think he sees that. And the question that we have for the country is, how do we operationalize that in the government? How do we operationalize on church on Sunday? How do we actually live it and be it? Because I think that we've seen the consequence of choosing to be at each other's throats. And
we're reaping it.
Reap what you sow.
We're reaping it. I think when Hakeem Jeffries gave his speech on the House floor, and he was almost like an MLK, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? From the Bible, choose ye this day. And he goes down this American values over autocracy. When he said the Constitution over cult, benevolence over bigotry, it was like he was laying it out, which America has to decide who she is.
I think that we are at that point. But let me say this. There has never been, given a president like this, with the robust federal resources that are now coming down and the partnership that he has with the governors and the mayors, at least on the political side, there's never been a better opportunity for America to kind of right itself and say that we don't have the resources to go forward. Now it's really a matter of choice, and it's a matter of execution, because we have the resources now. Every governor around the country is now, talking about the surplus that they have. They have surpluses because the federal government showed up at a time we were hurting the most. When the mayors are saying, I didn't have the resources, they have them now. So whether we're talking about crime, or whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about drug treatment, whether we're talking about building roads and bridges, whether we're talking about all of the other things that have really worked us, we now have an opportunity, but we've got to make a choice, as the president says, to try to build big things. And the only way we can do it is to do it together. He says this is the United States of America, for God's sakes. And we have to figure out how we're going to kind of, wrap ourselves up for a minute, look forward, and then make the right choices that actually unify the country, lift us up rather than push us down. And that's what President Biden has been trying to do. And I'm happy to be a very, very small part of that much larger effort.
Well, sir, thank you for the work that you're doing and helping in this coordination, for the work that you have done in the past. And, you are always welcome on this platform. Love talking to you. Love when you can break it down for us, what's happening. And best of luck to this project and convincing some of these state leaders what they need to do.
Well, thank you for those comments, and then thank you for your witness too, because it's really important that you hold us accountable and you hold our feet to the fire. And when we're trying to speak truth to power, you make sure that we're doing the things we say we do, and we have to bring the receipts to demonstrate that you can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk, and that's what President Biden's doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right, Ebony, thank you.